Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today for our Goodwin Proctor Life Sciences What's Next series. And today, my partner Elizabeth Mulkey and I are going to be talking about the future of biotech regulation. There is so much going on in this space right now. Even just today, May 20th, 2025, prior to the webinar starting today, more developments this morning on most favored nation pricing. So today, we're going to spend some time talking about what are those current trends, what's going on right now. If you can't keep track of every moving piece, we're going to try to give it to you in a nutshell here. We want to talk about drug pricing, domestic manufacturing, the latest with China, and how these trends are going to shape future requirements for biotechnology regulation. Next slide, please. So our presentation, of course, we are lawyers, Elizabeth and I, so we need to disclaim everything we say. The following presentation is not intended to be legal advice. We're expressing our own views today based on publicly available information that we've gleaned from our own interactions with clients, and also from our connections with personnel in the Trump administration and where they are focused currently. Given the volume of attendees today and given the sensitivity of some of the issues we're talking about, we will be recording this session, but we will not be taking Q&A today. If you want to schedule some time with me and with Elizabeth, or if you want to send us your questions, please scan the QR code. You'll see this on every slide today. This will connect you directly with me and with Elizabeth, and we'll be happy to respond to your questions and or set up some time. Next slide, please. All right. Well, the future of biotech regulation is not necessarily clear, but what we'd like to do today is spend some time going through what is, to some, a period of uncertainty, of disruption. And we want to talk about what are some of the policy goals at a high level that are directing those regulatory changes? Where do we think those regulatory changes will go tomorrow? And today we're going to cover 5 core topics. So first, as you see on your screen, headwinds and tailwinds, the top policy issues that are really directing the Trump administration's focus when it comes to biotech and pharmaceutical regulation. We're going to be thinking about how we're currently in this intersection of a deregulatory environment coupled with a pro-innovation push, but what seems to be, or to some might seem to be, an anti-industry moment. And so how do all of those apparently conflicting policy positions seem to be implicated in regulatory changes? We're going to try to read the tea leaves a little bit there. Next slide. Number 2, the drug pricing horizon. We're going to cover for you today what are the Open Inflation Reduction Act issues that are still front and center for biotech and pharma. We'll talk about that drug pricing executive order from mid-April and what that means potentially for regulatory changes coming down the road. We'll talk about the current big, beautiful reconciliation bill. As many folks know, again, it's May 20th. President Trump actually went to the Hill today to lobby on behalf of this bill. So we know that it's important. We're expecting some floor action this week on the House side, and we'll talk a little bit about what you can see in there. CMS has also issued some directive policy statements and policy guidance that I think would be informative as well as we talk about drug pricing. Next slide. Hand in hand with that is, of course, the most favored nation executive order from just last week. And in fact, earlier today, OIG, or rather HHS and CMS announced that they have established most favored nation pricing targets for certain drugs, and they'll be announcing those shortly. So we'll talk about that, what it could possibly mean. Some legislation that's passing currently through Congress, the Hawley-Welch legislation, that would have the same effect as that most favored nation executive order. Next slide, please. Domestic manufacturing as part of the America First initiative is critical. Elizabeth's going to spend some time talking about what that might mean for FDA-regulated industries and in particular biotech. And finally, next slide. biotech as a national security interest. This is an area where we gave it a lot of spotlight last year when the Biosecure Act was passing through Congress and creating a lot of potential uncertainty in the industry. I'm here to tell you Biosecure is not back on the table this year, but we do have a recent congressional report on the future of biotechnology and its status as a national security asset for the United States that will have some significant implications for the regulatory environment moving forward. Again, we've got our QR code on each slide here, so please snap that and send us an email if you have questions. Next slide, please. So starting with headwinds and tailwinds and thinking about the broader policy initiatives that we see coming out of the Trump administration, if first we want to be thinking about how the deregulatory environment is really prospering currently. Last year, as folks know, the deregulatory theme sort of began with the Loper Bright case. We're going to talk about that, how that has an implication here today and for future regulatory efforts. So the deregulatory theme really is from the whole Make America Great Again and Make America Healthy Again effort to enhance innovation, and in particular, biotechnology and medical technology that can benefit patients. This is a pro-innovation, pro-deregulation environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean a pro-industry environment. In other words, the focus here is on all of that red tape and those barriers to competition that the regulatory regime that's built up over decades of regulatory guidances, notices, and the like has resulted in a slowdown of our system. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it is a free-for-all for business at this stage of the Trump administration. So a couple of things to be aware of. And I think when folks are trying to read the tea leaves as they hear the various breathless reports from the press and the like, be thoughtful of the policies that are really driving this, those underlying policies. So first, recognize that the administration does not view the FDA and healthcare system as it presently operates or previously operates as the gold standards. They see a fundamental crisis in the system that is focused too closely on cozy industry relationships and not enough decision-making by the doctor and the patient. And so the larger goal here is really to switch the HHS's focus, both FDA, CMS, and the other agencies, to disease prevention, chronic disease, eliminating industry influence and decision-making, but simultaneously speeding up that decision-making and making the primary voice in care the physicians and the patients. It's an all-hands-on-deck exercise across the executive branch. You can see on your screen here the multiple executive orders and presidential memos and requests for information that have come out so far this year. What's the current status? Well, very beginning in the administration in January, we had the 10-for-1 executive order, Unleashing Prosperity Through Deregulation. This really called on federal agencies to, for every new regulation they want to issue, to identify and eliminate 10 previous regulations. And that's broadly defined to include both formal and informal guidance. And the idea is that new regulation moving forward, at least under the Trump administration, is designed such that it won't have a net cost increase to the economy, to the industry, and the like. That's a great place to start for the industry. Whether you're an entrepreneur in startup biotech, whether you've been at this for many years, whether you're an investor, whether you're bringing a new product to market or perfecting a currently existing product, this is an area for opportunity, and all companies should be focused on identifying those regulatory requirements that have somehow caused a problem or upheld innovation or delayed a launch in the past. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get what you want if you raise these issues, but all conversations with the government right now should include some identification of these deregulatory opportunities to help the Trump administration as they try to make the system more efficient here. We saw the Doge effort that Elizabeth's going to spend a little bit of time talking about in a minute here. Earlier this year, the effort to realign HHS and how that's structured. Elizabeth's going to go into that. But we also just, tactically have opportunities as an industry to raise these issues. First, Trump in April said to the executive agencies, we're going to give you until June 10th. You need to identify unlawful regulations and take steps to repeal those by July 10th. Agencies need to say why they didn't repeal those regulations they'd previously highlighted. So we'll see some movement there over the coming months. We saw the Office of Management and Budget put out a broad public request for deregulatory ideas. Those were due on May 12th, so a little over a week ago. And we'll have an opportunity to see where some of those suggestions pan out. Of course, CMS issued an RFI as well recently for areas for streamlining, also on April 11th. Those comments are due on June 10th, so there's still an opportunity to comment there. As Elizabeth's going to note, FDA and HHS comments are due on July 12th. Elizabeth, let me kick it over to you for a minute to talk about the FDA and some of the potential changes we're seeing there.
Sure. Thanks so much, Matt. So yeah, if you follow what the agency is doing, you know that there's a lot that we don't know yet, a lot's in flux. But I think Matt's point about keeping the underlying themes in mind is really important to understand kind of the statements coming out of the agency and statement from top leadership at the agency, including Commissioner McCary. So, to that point, recently, the FDA's plan to lower cost and empower providers is part of a second deregulatory effort. And so, as Matt noted, the comments are going to be due shortly. This is, again, a really important opportunity for those of us in industry or those of us who support industry to identify places that we believe that FDA's processes can be streamlined in some way. So really be thoughtful about that and communicating with the agency and trying to frame things sort of a shared common goal. We all want to see innovative products make their way to patients. We all want to see what some believe to be a continued gold standard at FDA, or ways to improve what the FDA and what HHS are doing to support patients. I did want to briefly touch on, one piece of this deregulatory effort means that there's not as much coming out of the agency. As many of you know, most of what we hear about how FDA operates and FDA's policies typically comes through guidance. But because of this deregulatory effort, we're just not seeing as much movement on that front. And so there's been a lot more attention closely paid to public statements by leadership at FDA. Just last week, I was at the Food and Drug Law Institute annual meeting where Commissioner McCary gave a fireside chat and talked about some of the things that we can expect to see, which some of which we're already seeing this week, and kind of providing some goalposts and some forward-looking statements about what we think the agency may be doing in the future. Those reporting on kind of leadership statements or policy statements coming out of FDA and HHS are kind of more important, more now than ever. And so that's part of what Matt and I do, is kind of trying to consolidate and make sure that we have the most current thinking, or what's been publicly reported about the most current thinking from the agency, since we know that when you're out there developing products and running trials, you kind of have a lot else that you have on your plate to keep up with. So just a few quick points from Commissioner McCary's fireside chat. He talked a lot about wanting to keep a strong partnership between the industry and agency, but being very sure to keep the scientific review process intact. I think that goes to Matt's earlier point about ensuring that the relationship between the agency and industry isn't viewed as too cozy, wanting to rebuild the public trust in the agency, where some may believe that public trust may be lacking. He talked about a thing that we are kind of excited to monitor, tailoring the approval process for new therapeutics to the condition. So obviously, the example he gave was a therapeutic for stage 4 pancreatic cancer is going to be viewed very different by the agency than a cosmetic. We know that, but we also know that from prior public statements by the commissioner that there is some consideration to potentially a conditional approval pathway or more flexibility for products that are intended to treat rare diseases and for very small patient populations. That's something we're watching and really excited about that potential. Importantly, there's not going to be a very comprehensive reorganization of FDA. There have been reports that there might be a reorg to transition FDA to sort of function-focused centers. And Commissioner McCary has indicated that that reorganization is not planned, although there has been a reduction in force that's been widely reported on, no major reorg. A point that we'll get to a bit later, I think that this iteration of FDA is very excited about technological innovation and finding ways to speed efficiency in the process. So even if there is perhaps what some may view as an anti-industry bent to some of the thinking, there's still this idea that everyone wants good science to be able to be applied and brought to patients more efficiently. And so how can we, do things like reducing animal testing for certain types of products or better leveraging AI, both on the agency side and on the industry side? And one more thing to watch, I'll just note that, there is a new director of CBER, FDA's Center for Biologics, and we're all kind of anxiously awaiting hearing how his views may evolve now that he's on the agency side of things. So yeah, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt. That was kind of a lot about FDA, but we'll keep moving.
Yeah, well, and right now it's an interesting time. I mean, Elizabeth, you referenced the anti-industry bent. Of course, we have statements from Commissioner McCary about the cozy relationship with industry. RFK has long indicated a disdain for the close connections between industry and the reviewers who are responsible for seeing that products pass through the approval process. So we're in this stage where, if you're one of those folks that's, actively texting with your reviewer, that might be viewed as problematic. But a slowed, delayed review process at FDA is also viewed as equally as problematic. So the playing field has been leveled just a little bit here. In addition, with Loper Bright, the case from last year that really ended 40 years of precedent that required courts to defer to agency decisions that they were making about potentially ambiguous statutes. Now, courts will make those decisions. That gives plaintiffs and others who are fighting against regulatory regimes an opportunity in the courts as well. So we're at an interesting time for where regulation sits. All the more reason, though, why companies should be focused on their internal controls, on making sure that they have a narrative that demonstrates credibility and legitimacy in the industry, that the focus is truly on pure science, focus on medicines and clinical information, as opposed to the focus on profit and revenue, et cetera. Speaking of which, next slide, please. Drug pricing, of course, is a significant topic these days, and especially today. So we'll do a quick run through what's going on with drug pricing. First, the IRA is not going to go anywhere under Trump. There was a hearing actually just this morning on the Hill about how the Inflation Reduction Act is impeding medicines and impeding energy on the energy side. It's unlikely, however, that we're going to see a lot of movement legislatively on the Inflation Reduction Act in a way that decimates those provisions that are impactful on biotech, drug price negotiation, inflation rebates, and the like. The administration likes that idea of negotiation. We've heard loud and clear that they want drug prices to come down by any means possible. And those issues that the industry has raised over time that require fixes under the Inflation Reduction Act may have a better opportunity. So, for example, the orphan drug exception that's limited to one orphan indication or one orphan designation, the pill penalty that distinguishes between small molecule and large molecule drugs for when they're eligible to be selected for the drug price negotiation program, 7 versus 11 years, respectively. The idea that CMS has broad authority to define what it means to market a biosimilar or generic in a bona fide way. What does that mean? The therapeutic alternatives that CMS has significant authority to choose when electing that first price that they try to set under the drug price negotiation program. That still remains an issue. And then, of course, transparency in the negotiation program itself and having a good, clear sense of how those negotiations work, what CMS is using, and the like. Well, we do see a couple of bright signs coming out of the April 15th executive order that President Trump signed, lowering drug prices by once again putting Americans first. What can we expect? Well, it's a little bit of everything old is new again. These are all proposals that we've heard in the past, either during the Trump 45 administration or through, sort of public statements that the administration has made. But what we see in particular first, the HHS is directed to issue guidance for the next available program year under the drug negotiation program. That guidance is supposed to be issued June 14th. The draft guidance is out, came out last week, and is comments are due on June 12th. So we'll get those comments in just before the due date for actually releasing the final guidance, but presumably we'll have some final guidance on that over the summer. HHS is instructed to work with Congress to eliminate the pill penalty. A legislative act needs to happen in order for that to be fixed. It's baked into the statute. That's not something that the regulatory agency has any control over. And so having that fixed legislatively would be beneficial for the industry. Now, notably, we're going to talk in a second about the big, beautiful reconciliation bill that's currently floating through Congress. That pill penalty fix is not in there. It would have been a good legislative vehicle for that. There is legislation, independent legislation that's bubbling around Congress that does seek to tackle that. But this current bill, where there are provisions of the IRA addressed, does not talk about the pill penalty. So why does this matter? Well, really, kind of despite this potential industry carrot, so to speak, of the pill penalty fix, and, language in the executive order that the negotiation program should not be designed in a way that impedes innovation, there are clear signs that Trump will continue to put pressure on pharma and biotech margins. Drug pricing, HHS is directed under the executive order to address high-cost prescription drugs by developing rulemaking that would achieve better value for Medicare, even beyond the drug price negotiation program. Broad language, very undefined. But what do we think that means? We think that means that we're going to see CMS payment models and demonstration programs on different types of payments to test those pricing mechanisms to see whether anything sticks or is functional without creating a significant amount of disruption. Drug price reporting. There is a push into the executive order for HHS to develop a plan for surveying hospital acquisition costs of outpatient drugs. This is really impactful on the 340B program. That's that deep discount that certain types of providers, rural healthcare hospitals, and certain specialty hospitals qualify for based on the types of patients they see. This has been a real mess of an area for HHS for many, many years. In fact, there was a case the government won in a matter earlier today. Haven't spent a lot of time reading the recent decision. Literally just came out a couple hours ago. But this is an area that's quite active and one where we will expect to see HHS to dive in. Medicaid, the Medicaid drug program, for folks who participate in that Medicaid drug rebate program, you know how complicated it is, and you know how difficult it is to meet all of the intricacies of those requirements. There's a lot of mess and a lot of inaccuracy in that program. And the executive order directs HHS to come up with a to create a coordinated effort, rather, to address that issue. We've got a couple of ideas we might share if we have time later today. Access to epinephrine and insulin should be at a deep discounted price to low-income Medicare beneficiaries. That's found its way into the executive order. Of course, reevaluating the role of middlemen and PBMs, that is front and center for the Trump administration and for Congress. And this is one of those areas where the industry, biotech and pharmaceutical companies and their investors, can really focus on describing the value chain and the supply chain around pharmaceuticals and who is receiving what types of payments for what purposes. We can get a sense of where there might be inefficiencies in the system. PBM transparency is something that's called for in the executive order, though notably the most recent version of the reconciliation bill eliminated a PBM transparency requirement. Focus on competition, to think about importation and to sort of streamline and develop a process and a pathway for safe and high quality drugs to be imported, among many other requirements in that executive order. Um, we'll see as the regulatory push develops. You see on your screen here the various directives under that executive order and what we may expect to see over the coming months and year. You'll see the due dates for when action has been called on by President Trump for the agencies to take steps, and we can expect to see some movement over the summer. You see there's sort of a locus of actions that need to be taken, and then again in the fall in October. The big, beautiful reconciliation bill I've referenced now multiple times. The orphan drug IRA fix is included in the most recent version of the reconciliation bill. As folks know, the current version of the Medicare drug price negotiation program says that orphan drugs, those drugs that are designated to treat rare diseases or ultra rare diseases, are exempt from going through that negotiation process, but only if they have one designation and only if they're treating one indication. So if the second you get a second designation or the second you pursue a second indication, you're automatically put into that potential for being considered for the negotiation program. That, the industry has, decried for many years now, really does disincentivize investment into orphan drug products and rare disease companies, which are in part a huge segment of the biotech industry. And so that fix would be a real boon for the industry. It would prohibit PBMs from engaging in aggressive, what they call spread pricing under Medicaid. And it would also implement a Trump era rule from Trump 45 that would severely restrict how PBMs can be paid, only flat fees, all transparent, and the like. This was actually a part of a regulation that the Trump administration issued at the end of 2020. The Biden administration delayed it, and under the IRA, it was delayed 10 years to 2032. So this is another IRA fix that really is going to be a hot issue under the Trump administration. Really quickly, I know we're booking through this here. CMS under Dr. Oz, we are aware that he is committed to continuing the IRA program, drug price negotiation program. He made that very clear during his confirmation hearings. It is likely that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, or CMMI, is going to develop innovative payment and delivery models. We talked about that. So expect to see some proposals coming out there. This could be things like testing different types of rebate models, different types of reference pricing. They can be mandatory or voluntary, these programs, but to the extent that CMMI starts to create perhaps, let's say, a most favored nation pricing model, that it will likely be subject to significant challenge. So be watchful about that. Of course, just earlier today, CMS announced that they have identified the initial most favored nation drug pricing targets. We're going to talk in a minute about how that will impact the executive order from last week. But before we do, CMMI held a conference last week where they talked about their pillars for advancing these programs. What are we going to see from CMS? We're going to see more evidence-based, preventive types of demonstration products. We want to see, we expect to see programs where technology and data sharing is leveraged across patients, that information decision-making tools, educational materials, and quality performance data is provided more to patients, and that patients have more choice in their providers. And this is harkens back to the Trump policy of keeping the physician and the provider the key voices in delivering care. Next slide, please. Most favored nation pricing. This is not new, although the executive order that came out last week is certainly a more aggressive stance than the Trump 45 effort. Folks might recall that under the Trump 45 administration, that CMMI created a demonstration project that would have been mandatory for all Medicare Part B providers, most at least. That's it. Physician, a hospital outpatient, a practice group, an ASC, really, most types of providers are Part B providers. And anytime they would have submitted a claim for a Part B drug, those are drugs that are administered in the facility or outpatient setting, that they would be paid at a price that was set based on a most favored nation index. This was done through an interim notice and comment rulemaking. Courts rejected it. They said that under the Administrative Procedures Act that there needed to be full comment, that there was insufficient due process. The court understood from the opponents, the industry, that this would be an interference with contracts that are already set between providers and manufacturers. It would have negative economic consequences for providers who prescribe these drugs, and that patients likely would lose out on access. Well, I think we can learn a lot about how the Trump administration will implement this most favored nation executive order if we look at their responses to that original rule. So if you think about that original rule, the thing you have to realize is that was about Part B drugs. Part B drugs, they're administered in a facility setting. They are purchased and paid for by the provider. So the manufacturer's already been paid. There's a contract, they've received their payment, and now the provider has the product to use and then to bill once they use it. Well, if the price that they can bill it for is significantly reduced below what they paid for it, that's going to create an economic issue. The government said that's not a concern for several reasons. Back in 2020, they said first that they were going to phase in this most favored nation pricing, that it would be a combination of current pricing and most favored nation pricing, a blend that would be phased in over time. We might expect to see that with the most recent most favored nation proposal. In addition, the Trump administration in 2020 was really focused on the fact that natural market forces will force providers to choose the lowest cost drugs, which will naturally cause manufacturers to reduce their pricing. Not sure that that's entirely going to happen, but we can also see that the Trump administration will be focused on those natural market forces, free markets, to really drive change here. The argument that manufacturers raise that there is a heavy administrative burden with complying, that the complexities and nuances of collecting this information were too great. CMS's response at the time was basically cry me a river, right? That the data is available from many sources, that it's a limited number of country, that there are plenty of consultants out there who can help verify this information. But CMS did say at the time that if there are small biotech companies that are having trouble meeting these requirements, reach out to us. That if there's an opportunity to develop a ramp-up period for manufacturers, that they were open to those suggestions. So we can expect to see that sort of potential opening, maybe for smaller companies with this round. Talking about how this most favored nation executive order from last week differs a little bit, the key buzzword here is equalization. If you watch the press conference where they announced this, President Trump talked about equalization, the idea that the administration places the blame for high drug costs largely on the shoulders of foreign governments who demand that drug companies sell their products at a deep discount in those countries, or else the country will not purchase the product or won't open the markets up to that product. This kind of heavy-handed negotiation has resulted in prices in the United States, according to the administration, being 5 to 10 times higher for the same drug than in similarly situated countries. And so, even with the Inflation Reduction Act negotiated drugs, Trump showed a chart showing that that price, that lower negotiated price for those drugs that have already gone through, is still several times higher than prices paid in some of the OECD countries. So when we think about equalization, what the goal here is not to just reduce prices in the United States. It is to raise prices abroad while reducing prices in the United States to create more of an equal playing field across the board. So how is HHS and the administration going to achieve this? Well, first, the executive order directs HHS to develop most favored nation pricing targets. Just today was the announcement that they have done that. They haven't released the specific prices yet for the drugs that have been identified, but we do expect to see that over the next week. Notably, when you read the executive order, it really is directing manufacturers to make, quote, significant progress towards these targets, that there isn't any specific direction about how they're supposed to make that significant progress. But the order does say, look, for those companies that are achieving their most favored nation targets, we're going to be open to looking for a pathway for direct to consumer or direct to patient purchases that will eliminate the middleman and naturally reduce prices across the value chain. That is, again, a direction. It is a push to the industry. There's no requirement in here yet. But what the order says is if you don't hit those, if you don't make that significant progress, HHS will issue a rule to impose most favored nation pricing. HHS might even direct Congress to consider individualized importation on a case-by-case basis for drugs, and that FDA will look at the potential for modifying or even revoking approvals for drugs. Let me turn it over to Elizabeth to share a little bit more about that and to lead us forward to the next topic.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So that was a really interesting provision that we saw in the executive order because FDA does have the authority to review and revoke approvals or licensures for products for reasons of safety or efficacy. And so there's not, sort of a new authority that's necessarily being articulated in the executive order. I think the implication is that FDA may be directed or HHS may be involved in reviewing pricing as an element of whether a product is appropriately on the market or not. So I think we could expect some pushback if that were to come to pass. And so I think that's certainly something that we'll want to watch closely, particularly as Matt said, at the moment, it's not totally clear how significant progress towards these pricing goals is going to be evaluated. And so I think that's something we are definitely going to watch more closely. If we can move to the next slide, we're going to talk about our next kind of concept here. So this ties in really well to the points that Matt raised earlier, and then one that we're going to talk about towards the end of our discussion. So the points that Matt raised earlier about this idea of kind of equalization with respect to most favored nation pricing, but also making sure that we are on equal footing with the rest of the world and that manufacturers and businesses in the US are not being subject to more onerous requirements than entities located outside of the US. Because again, there's this idea that we want to promote innovation in this country. So there's that concept. And then another concept is sort of this idea that biotech as a whole is a very important industry, and we want to keep as much of that industry here as possible and really protect American innovation. And you do see concerns, whether those were from the previous administration with Biosecure, as Matt touched on again, or now the Senate report on the security of biotech that Matt's going to discuss in more detail. There is really this idea that we want to protect American industry, even though there's sort of this, arguably tailwind against or not necessarily favorable to industry. This is a theme that continues to come through. And so this executive order that was released just a couple weeks ago on domestic manufacturing is really focused on the barriers that there are for building new pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities in the US and really getting these operations off the ground. And so, from a practical perspective, if you've ever developed a drug or gotten a drug approved and then tried to get it out on the market, you know that for some drugs, manufacturing changes are extremely sensitive. Whether there are, slight changes in a line that's used to produce a biological product, for example, that can implicate having to go back to FDA, get sign off on that, or whether you can actually use a different supplier for a particular component of a drug that you're manufacturing. And the idea of tech transfer as between manufacturing facilities can again be a huge investment of time and resources for a company that wants to make changes in the process. So we all kind of know that manufacturing is a sensitive, time-consuming area of getting products actually out on the market. And these concerns about supply chain, concerns about use of foreign manufacturers aren't necessarily new. But this is sort of an interesting angle on how the government intends to potentially equalize the playing field, or that's the goal, as between American manufacturers and manufacturers outside the US. So we've listed out here some of the action items. I think what's interesting to note is that there are a number of action items listed out in this executive order, but only a couple of them actually implicate FDA, because a lot of the permitting and kind of the red tape is on the environmental side of things. So FDA does require applicants for a new drug application or a BLA to submit an environmental assessment as part of that application. But that's not so much focused on the manufacturing plant itself. That permitting piece is really within EPA's purview. And so part of the executive order is really about kind of that environmental permitting component. So not so much in FDA's court. But what FDA has been instructed to do is to evaluate its current regulations and guidance related to domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing and improve the current inspection regime for foreign manufacturers and provide more detailed information about that process. So what does that mean? So FDA has been directed to evaluate or to reevaluate its own risk-based approach to determine when inspections of manufacturing facilities are necessary prior to product approvals. So that goes to how FDA actually prioritizes the types of facilities and how frequently it's going to inspect different types of facilities. So, for the example FDA gives currently is a facility where a sterile product is being manufactured and that facility has never been inspected by FDA. That's going to be a lot higher on FDA's list than a place where, say, an OTC product, an over-the-counter drug product that's lower risk if something were to go wrong and it's had a continual inspection history. Well, FDA needs to evaluate which of those is a higher risk facility. So FDA has been directed to take another look at that and make sure that the requirements for manufacturing facilities where new products are being manufactured are not overly burdensome. So to the point about FDA's inspection of foreign manufacturing facilities, I think this is where the kind of the rubber meets the road on this idea. So FDA also, outside of this executive order, but in connection with this policy, FDA announced a planned inspection of its a planned expansion of its foreign unannounced inspections pilot program. So the executive order talks about how domestic manufacturing facilities are often subject to unannounced inspections by FDA. But outside the US, those manufacturing facilities, those manufacturers typically have notice. And, that's kind of, I think FDA may say that's for practical reasons. Sometimes these manufacturing facilities are located in rural areas that are hard to get to. And we want to make sure that if we're sending inspectors out there, someone's going to be on site. We have the right people on site. If there are any language barriers, that we're kind of matching people up appropriately to ensure that the inspector can get the correct information. So there are some logistical hurdles. But FDA has launched this pilot program previously to do more unannounced inspections. And this planned expansion would actually expand the initial scope beyond human drug products. So, kind of TBD on the allocation as between medical devices and human drug products here. But FDA does seem to have some willingness to do this. I think one challenge is going to be the personnel available to do this. So Commissioner McCary has been very clear that inspectors were not impacted in the RIF, but there are some of those logistical details that I mentioned. Some of the folks who helped coordinate that for inspectors, we've heard reports that those individuals were impacted in the RIF. And so it may be difficult sometimes for the inspectors to be kind of setting up their own travel and coordinating the planned on-site visits of those foreign manufacturing facilities. The executive order also talks about clarifying current policies to make sure that FDA inspectors refuse travel accommodations from regulated industry they're inspecting. But I will note that FDA does already have a written policy prohibiting foreign or domestic regulated industry for paying for that, but it's sort of reiterating that approach kind of along with that initial concept we talked about making sure that the agency and industry aren't overly cozy. And so I think the practical challenges of implementing this, we will see because we'll see how it plays out because FDA has been instructed to provide more information publicly about how many foreign manufacturing facilities are being inspected and the results of those inspections. So I think we can expect to see data points on how many more inspections are being conducted, whether there are any findings, whether FDA issues more 483s, Form FDA 483s of inspection findings, whether FDA is issuing more warning letters, for example, to foreign manufacturing facilities. But that's going to be something to watch. I'll also note that the longtime leader of this part of FDA left just around the time that this executive order was issued. But just this week, FDA has appointed a new leader who was the deputy of this piece of the agency. And so she will be kind of taking the reins on implementing this policy. So more to come. I'll turn it back over to Matt because I think that a piece of this ties in really nicely to what you're about to talk about, Matt, which is this idea of really protecting and promoting American innovation.
Yeah, no, that's right, Elizabeth, and thanks so much. I mean, what I might suggest is we take one quick minute here to reflect on what we've kind of talked about on the U.S. front, the U.S. policy front. So, from a FDA perspective, greater emphasis on domestic manufacturing, incentives for bringing U.S. biotech production here to the U.S. That's a positive for the industry. On the flip side, our relationships as part of the industry, our relationships with government regulators have been viewed over time now as too close. So having that distance is going to be something that's impactful and important for the administration. What does that mean? What does that mean practically for our biotech companies that are trying to work with KOLs, HCPs to serve on their advisory boards and the like? To the extent those really high profile KOLs are also potentially working on clinical research, they're being consulting with FDA on different issues, they may be reluctant to continue the industry side of those connections. So just be mindful of that. As Elizabeth noted, there has been a significant push to protect biotechnology as a national security interest. Next slide, please. And just a few weeks ago in April, the National Security Commission for Emerging Biotechnology, next slide, please, if you wouldn't mind, released a report that really identifies and highlights how the biotechnology industry can be leveraged as a national security interest here. And what is this report? Well, first of all, what's this National Security Commission? Most folks haven't heard of this. This was formed in 2022, and if we could switch the slide forward, thank you. Formed in 2022 by Congress to develop recommendations to advance U.S. leadership and biotechnology for national security reasons and economic resilience reasons. This report was issued. It's a very robust report with a significant amount of recommendations, 6 pillars that I'm going to walk through at a very high level. But what's the idea here? The idea is that China is ascending to be the leader in biotechnology in the world. Because China has had implemented policies for 20 years that are centralized at a countrywide level that prioritizes the industry. The report notes that there's been too many hurdles in the U.S. environment and in the marketplace to allow for the U.S. to really advance as the predominant place for biotechnology. And so this report kind of goes through this history of scientific development, talking about the age of chemistry at the end of the 1800s to the age of physics in the mid 20th century. And now that we're in the age of biotechnology, with biology as the basis of innovation, we need to envision a world in which the US takes a front seat in that marketplace. And so, what does the report do? It creates a blueprint for legislative and executive action that will impact biotech to its core. First, Pillar 1, prioritizing biotechnology at the national level. Here, the commission, which is chaired by Senator Todd Young from Indiana, calls on Congress to establish a national biotechnology coordination office within the office of the president. So this would be a presidential appointment that coordinates all agency actions on biotechnology competition and regulation. What does that mean? Well, I think what we can expect that to mean, if this is something that comes into play, is that there'll be that additional kind of layer of oversight above FDA and NIH and CMS and all the various HHS agents, sub-agencies that have a hand in biotechnology regulation, that will see some better coordination at that level. Pillar 2, mobilizing the private sector to get U.S. products to scale. Some of the recommendations that you'll see in here is Congress needs to direct agencies to create simple pathways to market products, to exempt familiar products from unnecessary regulation, preparing better for novel products to come to market. We're dealing in a world where artificial intelligence is infusing everything from drug development to how we review claims data from insurance companies. And that includes our medical products. And so we need to be ready for that as a government. Creating an independent investment fund, much like many foreign countries have, that would be led by a non-governmental leader, but invests in technology startups, creating public-private manufacturing centers of excellence that would help small biotechs scale up their manufacturing to get to market without having to depend on, for example, Chinese biotech companies. Looking to develop a network of researchers that allows for greater access and quicker access to top-line, high-level information that will allow faster and quicker and better, more comprehensive research. And then notably, one recommendation under Pillar 2 is to prohibit companies that work with U.S. national security agencies and HHS from using Chinese biotechnology suppliers deemed to pose a national security threat. This reeks of Biosecure. So if folks recall, last year, the Biosecure Act would have limited the ability of companies that do business with the federal government from doing business with certain named Chinese biotech companies. This is finding its way back into the discussion with this recommendation in the Senate Biotech report. Maximizing the benefits of biotechnology for defense. There's a lot of discussion in the report about how biotechnology can benefit our U.S. defense and military forces. And then building a workforce around biotechnology with an educated private sector with necessary expertise that's grown and developed from the youngest ages, creating new green cards and opportunities for foreigners who are biotech experts to recruit that talent into the United States. So we certainly see a lot of potential changes on the far horizon coming out of this report that has the potential to really impact how the biotechnology industry works and functions in the United States. So we encourage everybody to download a copy of that report. You see the title page there, and take a look. It's a lengthy read, but it gives an interesting insight as to how policymakers view biotech as a national security asset. Next slide, please. So just to kind of wrap it up here in the last 5 minutes, we're calling this prognostications. Maybe it's really more of an assessment of the opportunities and challenges, just given this whole jumble of different policies and moving parts that we have going on here. A couple that stand out to me, and I just really have to emphasize streamlining regulatory hurdles. Even when you're in a situation where you are commenting, for example, on a potential regulation that is going to create some kind of administrative burden, make sure you're identifying those other regulatory regimes or requirements that maybe they're outdated, maybe they don't have any bearing in the current way that biotech works, and raise those and be open about those. Improve chances of winning regulatory challenges at court, I think, is also hand in hand with that we can see that the future of biotech regulation is going to be streamlined, and it's going to be efficient. It's going to be pro innovation, but it's not necessarily going to be the type of environment where we will, hear from an industry representative or a government representative at every industry conference, where we're going to be on a texting basis with our reviewers at FDA, where we're able to pick up the phone and necessarily call somebody at CMS that you've had a close relationship for many years. So we do see that as a bit of a challenge as well. Elizabeth, what's top of mind for you?
Yeah, so just quickly, I think one challenge and sort of framing of that we're thinking about on the FDA side is that, as I mentioned, we're still, anxiously viewing every tidbit of information that we get from new FDA leadership, Dr. McCary, and the new CBER director, Dr. Prasad. And so I think that with the reduction in force at the agency, and the kind of personnel changes at the top, we're sort of waiting to see how those personnel shifts affect day-to-day interactions with the agency. So, for example, until we have, kind of clear guidance on what new potential review and approval pathways might look like for rare disease products, for example, there may be some hesitancy on the part of sort of the lower level staffers at FDA, the everyday, the staffers that you're interacting with on a daily basis, those review staff, to exercise kind of regulatory flexibility until we know sort of what direction the agency is heading. And so with that in mind, to the point about making sure that your asks are well justified, do keep that in mind in your interactions with the agency, kind of framing requests narrowly, being sure that you're teeing up things to get clear responses from the agency, and really focusing the resources that they have right now. I think that's one thing that we'd keep in mind. And then my very last point is just that through all of this, a thread that I think is important is that there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that patient voices are heard in the drug development process. No industry representatives on ad committees, but wanting to really emphasize patient voices in the patient community. And so I think that's the way that many of the companies we work with already are approaching product development. And so making sure that that story comes through in your interactions with the agency is just something to keep in mind now more than ever.
Well said, Elizabeth. And we're so grateful for everybody joining us today. As noted at the outset, please reach out. This is a lot of information. There's a lot of moving parts here, whether you want to talk about drug pricing, most favored nation prices, FDA inspections, domestic manufacturing. We're happy to set up time with you and respond to your questions. So please reach out. And thank you again for joining us today.